Welcome to USI Snapshots, where we do little overviews of big themes in American history. Today, American industrialization. Our focus points for today. The United States economy changed from an agricultural economy, or one that's based on farming, to an industrial one, or an economy that is based on manufacturing, over the course of the 1800s. Several key inventions changed ways of life drastically and altered the development of the country. While there were many benefits to these innovations, there have also been lasting and severe problems due to industrialization. During the 19th century, or the 1800s, America both contributed to and was transformed by industrialization. This was a shift towards manufacturing and factory-style labor and the benefits that come with it, the economics that come with it. There are also several costs we're going to talk about. Between 1860 and 1910, the USA became one of the most advanced industrial economies in the entire world. The era is often referred to the Gilded Age, or gilded meaning dipped in gold, due to the wealth and the concentration of wealth created during this time period. Here you can see pie charts that show the distribution of world manufacturing. In 1880, you can see that America, the blue, their share of the pie was only about 15% of global manufacturing, meaning goods that are produced in factories. By 1900, it's almost up to a quarter of the world's share, 24%. And by 1913, it's almost up to a third of the world's share of manufacturing, at 32%. Several innovations transformed life in America. One was the discovery of fossil fuels to be used in combustion engines. Fossil fuels come from decomposed carbon-based matter that is extracted from the earth in various ways. And the main ones that we use are oil, coal, and natural gas. Here you can see the first oil well ever built by Edwin Drake in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859. This extracts liquid crude out of the earth, and then it becomes processed and gets refined into things like gasoline or plastic. In fact, this has become such a huge part of our economy, and we've become so dependent on oil that we're willing to invest tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to develop these deep water oil rigs to extract oil from under the ocean. Another huge innovation at this time was the invention of steel. Henry Bessemer in 1850 invented a process in which you can inject air into molten iron, and that takes out the carbon, which is actually what causes rust. This makes it much more strong, and we call that steel. Iron minus the impurities are steel. Here you can see the tray where you'd pour in the iron blocks and melt them down, and when you put air in the bottom, this carbonic matter, slag, comes to the bottom, and you are left with much more pure metal. And when you can have that strong metal, you can then use it to build things like railroad tracks. And the railroads were the single biggest customer for American steel, but it also developed things like barbed wire and the steel plow, which transformed farming, especially in the western areas that are being opened up by the railroads. This also changed building techniques. It allowed for taller and taller buildings that we might call skyscrapers, and some of the biggest structures that humanity had ever seen, like the Brooklyn Bridge, which in 1883 was actually like man landing on the moon. It was a huge achievement. It was one of the wonders of the world, one of the biggest structures on Earth. You can see an artist's depiction of the Brooklyn Bridge in the mid-1880s. This time period was also a time period of huge amount of explosion in inventions. We can see that by the number of patents that were granted. A patent is issued by the United States Patent Office, which gives a person intellectual rights over a particular idea. So you could patent an idea for an invention, and you could see that the amount of inventions that are being granted patents by the United States Office of Patents is going up and up and up throughout the 1800s. One of the most famous inventors from this time was from New Jersey, and his name was Thomas Edison, known as the Wizard of Menlo Park, and he brought us from his lab, which you can still go visit, and I think it's in South Orange, New Jersey, the Edison Museum. Sorry if I got that detail wrong. The light bulb he invented. the phonograph, the predecessor of the modern record player, and the original motion picture camera, which the technology moving a bunch of still frame pictures in fast sequences, still the basic idea of how video cameras work today. In addition, the telephone was a huge invention in 1876, and while Alexander Graham Bell got the economic rights to it in America, and the Bell telephone companies became very powerful, there were many others who disputed this invention as their own, including Antonio Meucci and Elisha Gray, and several others. It was never fully resolved as to who actually invented the telephone for real. Another huge invention in this time period was the typewriter. Before 1867, every document had to be written by hand or by printing press. The typewriter and the telephone really laid the foundation for the modern office space. And one of the effects of this was that it opened up the labor force to women like never before in America. In 1870, women made up only 5% of the office workers. In 1910, they made up 40%. And it probably has something to do with them getting the right to vote by the late 19 teens. Additionally, transportation was transformed by inventions like the airplane or the Model T automobile. Now, there were some benefits to this industrialization and these new technologies, one of them being the concept of efficiency, which has become one of the hallmarks of American business and global business, really. And that is the ability to do things faster and more cheaply. So less work in and more output out is the principle of efficiency. This is often achieved by producing on a much more large scale than before. So whereas pre-industrial work was typically done by hand and one person might make something start to finish, when you start producing in a mass production setting, you usually put people in very small jobs that they can do repetitively over and over again and make things go much faster. Now this increases efficiency, but only to a point. Those of you who will study economics will learn the law of diminishing returns. Efficiency only gives you more profitability up into a certain point where it starts to not really pay off so much. But this leads to massive amounts of wealth generated, but a lot of inequality along with that, which we'll talk about later. But it also leads to many new opportunities for women and immigrants who may have been previously excluded from the workforce. Here you can see the picture of the assembly line, which was innovated by Henry Ford in his automobile factories. And instead of one engineer building a machine start to finish, you take tasks and break them down into very small parts that can be done by multiple people repetitively over and over again. And then you can get a much faster and more efficient operation. Now, this also enabled more powerful businesses to emerge. In the 1800s, the idea of a pool became actually legally codified. It became a legal term where companies would make secret agreements and they would try to basically fix prices and get rid of their competitors. This led to, in 1887, the government passing the Interstate Commerce Act and creating the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate these huge companies and these agreements that are now crossing state boundaries. And the one that probably gets the most notoriety during the late 1800s, the one that's the most well-known, is called a trust. And this is a situation in which one company buys out all its competitors. One of the most famous was run by this gentleman over here, John Rockefeller, who grew his oil company, Standard Oil, into a monopoly, basically meaning that one business controls an entire industry. Here you can see a political cartoon depicting Standard Oil's tentacles reaching around the Congress of the United States and politicians, and just the kind of control that such a vast, vast business can have. So there are two kinds of monopolies. You can integrate an industry horizontally, in which you buy up all the oil wells and you buy out all your competitors. That's called horizontal integration. And if you actually buy up the entire supply chain from start to finish, extraction of raw materials to shipping of raw materials to manufacturing of raw materials into goods, and then those goods getting transported and those goods getting sold, that's called vertical integration. Another new type of business emerged in the late 1800s, and that was the holding company. This is the predecessor of the modern day mutual fund or hedge fund, in which one person or business is buying up shares of ownership and stocks in publicly traded companies and then selling them, hopefully for a profit. It's actually led to the building of Wall Street. We can see Wall Street right after the Civil War here is relatively modest, and by the turn of the 20th century, you can see all the bustling activity, the tall buildings, and the very fancy New York Stock Exchange, which is still kind of the seat of the global economy in some ways. What this produced also was a record number of corporate mergers, meaning that big publicly traded companies are merging with each other and becoming bigger. And so you can see it spike up right around the turn of the century. So businesses are getting bigger, they're getting more powerful, they're also producing a lot more. We can see that the iron and steel production goes up a tremendous amount in the late 1800s into the early 1900s in the United States. But there are a lot of major costs to this industrialization. First of all, the wealth that was generated was not equally distributed. In fact, workers often faced very poor conditions and low wages, while the owners of business enjoyed incredible amounts of wealth. And we've talked about that companies became monopolies, and this was actually anti-competitive and could lead to a very kind of abusive situation where one company could dictate prices and really have no competition to check on them, their own power. There are some social changes that we'll talk about. The impacts of these are debatable, but people's ideas about wealth and who deserved what really started to change in the 1800s. You can see here that the notion of inequality was really criticized. This is a political cartoon from the turn of the century, and you can see people like Cornelius Vanderbilt here, basically being the fat cats on the top, being held up by all the workers working for $11 a week or $9 a week, the cloth workers, the linen workers, the lumber workers. You can also see here the criticism in the late 1800s that here's the Senate. This is the Senate of the monopolists, by the monopolists, for the monopolists. So these big fat cat trusts are now controlling politics in Washington. And there's probably still an argument for that going on in American politics today. The other depiction was they called the big businessmen the robber barons. Robber barons is a medieval term. Here you can see the peasants having to offer up their gold to the wealthy vassals who own the land. And below here you see all the workers offering up all their wages and their taxes and their interest on mortgages up to the big, most powerful companies. Now, these attitudes started to shift about wealth in the late 1800s. There was this philosophy called social Darwinism, where in society, the strong survive and the weaker will die off and make the species stronger. And this kind of justified inequality. It said inequality is inevitable and good, it's natural. This also helped to fuel a lot of arguments that were very racist as well. And one very, very wealthy man, Andrew Carnegie, published an article in 1901 called The Gospel of Wealth, and he said that the wealthy must act as the trustees for the poor, basically meaning that the wealthy need to give back a lot of their disposable income and help develop society for the better. Now, also attitudes about wealth developed like the rags to riches story. People believed that they could go from nothing and become super, super wealthy, like a guy like Andrew Carnegie, who started out as a postal worker in a steel company and eventually turned it into a steel monopoly for himself. Wealth inequality is still a problem, and a lot of people think that America is a little bit more even, but it's certainly not close to the ideal. You can see the top 20% of Americans have a tremendous amount of the wealth still to this day. Now, there's some other major costs of industrialization, like harsh working conditions. In factories, they were very dangerous and polluted and could often cause illness, disease, and various other kinds of injuries. There were very few rights for workers. Labor unions were starting to form, but they were illegal and cracked down upon by hired police like the Pinkertons. There were also massive pollution and environmental issues created by factory labor and industrialization, and of course the lack of consumer protection, as you're going to see in the source, The Jungle, where it's described as just what goes into sausages in the meatpacking plant. But here you can see a kind of turn of the century child labor in a loom going on, very, very dangerous conditions, exploitation of children, and we could still see that today, like with mines in Pakistan, or here's a balloon plant in Bangladesh using child labor. Here's garbage sorting in China using very, very young children to sort through electric wires, or e-waste sorting, which is highly dangerous. There's toxic chemicals inside cell phones and other kinds of electronic waste. But children are put to work all over the world still to this day. So the progressive movement emerges as a response to these conditions with various successes and failures.